The cemetery sat on a lonely hill outside Asheville, and the cold November rain seemed determined to make an already unbearable day even worse. My name is Edwin Morrison. I am 71 years old, a retired structural engineer, and on that morning I stood beneath a black umbrella watching my wife of 46 years disappear into the ground. Margaret had been my partner through every chapter of my life. She was there when I was struggling to build my career, when we bought our first house, when our children were born, and when we became grandparents. Yet somehow, at the moment she left this world forever, almost nobody was there to say goodbye. There were only 5 people at the funeral. Me, the funeral director, a young pastor who barely knew her, and 2 elderly friends from her old book club. That was all. I kept checking my phone even though I already knew what I would find. Nothing. No missed calls. No messages. No explanation. Just silence. The silence hurt more than the rain. 2 days earlier, I had personally called both of my children. My daughter Catherine promised she would be there. My son Theodore said there was no chance he would miss his mother's funeral. Yet, as the service ended and the casket disappeared beneath the wet North Carolina soil, neither of them showed up. I told myself there had to be a reason. A canceled flight, a family emergency, something. Anything. But deep down, a feeling I did not want to acknowledge was beginning to grow inside me. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt wrong. Margaret's coat still hung beside the door. Her reading glasses were still on the coffee table. A small dish of dried orange peels sat near the stove exactly where she had left it. The house still carried traces of her presence, and somehow that made the emptiness even worse. I sat alone in the kitchen and stared at the chair where she used to drink tea every evening. Hours passed before I finally picked up the iPad she had bought me a few Christmases earlier. Margaret always said technology would keep me connected to the family. I opened social media hoping to distract myself for a few minutes. Instead, I found something that made my stomach drop. The first post I saw belonged to Catherine. She was smiling on a sailboat with her husband, holding a glass of wine while the sun set behind them. The photo had been posted that very morning, only minutes before Margaret's funeral began. My chest tightened. I kept scrolling. Then I found Theodore. He was standing on a stage at a real estate conference, smiling for cameras while shaking hands with investors. The timestamp showed he had posted it while his mother was being buried. In that moment, the grief inside me changed into something colder, something quieter, something that felt far more dangerous. And I had no idea that the next morning would reveal just how little my children cared about the woman we had just buried. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret's face. Not the face she had during those final weeks in hospice, but the face I fell in love with nearly 5 decades earlier. The woman who could walk into a room and somehow make everything feel less complicated. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep altogether. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands and stared out the window at the dark backyard. The rain had stopped, but the silence remained. It was the kind of silence that forces a man to think about things he has spent years avoiding. I kept replaying the posts I had seen online. Catherine laughing on a sailboat, Theodore smiling on a stage. Neither of them had called afterward. Neither of them had sent a message explaining why they missed their mother's funeral. It was as if the entire day had never happened. By sunrise, I had convinced myself there had to be more to the story. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe they felt guilty. Maybe they simply did not know how to face me after breaking their promise. Those excuses sounded weaker every time I repeated them. Around 7 o'clock, I walked through the house. Everywhere I looked, I found pieces of Margaret. Her gardening gloves near the back door, her favorite blanket folded over the couch, a grocery list still attached to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower, small reminders that she had existed, small reminders that she was gone. Then I remembered something she had said during her final week. We had been sitting quietly in the bedroom while autumn sunlight came through the window. She had squeezed my hand and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite understand. "Promise me you'll pay attention," she had said. At the time, I thought she was talking about my health. I thought she was worried about me being alone. Now, sitting in that empty house, I wasn't sure anymore. The memory stayed with me all morning. A strange feeling settled in my chest, Not fear, not anger, something closer to anticipation, as if an answer was coming whether I wanted it or not. At exactly 8:30, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house so suddenly that it made me jump. I walked to the front door expecting a neighbor, maybe one of Margaret's friends. Instead, I found Theodore and Catherine standing on the porch. Both of them were smiling. Both of them carried coffee. And for the first time since their mother died, they had finally decided to show up. For a moment, nobody spoke. Theodore stood there holding a paper bag from a fast food restaurant, while Catherine balanced a cardboard tray carrying 3 cups of coffee. If someone had taken a photograph right then, it would have looked like 2 caring children visiting their grieving father. The problem was that I had spent the entire previous day watching them choose everything else over their own mother. "Morning, Pop," Theodore said with a smile that seemed carefully rehearsed. "Thought we'd bring you breakfast." Before I could answer, he stepped past me and walked into the house as if he owned the place. Catherine followed behind him and kissed my cheek. "Daddy, we're so sorry about yesterday," she said softly. "Everything went wrong. We tried so hard to make it." I closed the door and watched them move toward the kitchen. Neither of them asked how I was doing. Neither of them mentioned their mother's funeral. Instead, they settled into their seats with the comfort of people arriving for a scheduled meeting. Theodore placed the paper bag on the table and started unpacking breakfast sandwiches. Catherine handed me a cup of coffee. "You need to eat something," she said. "You've probably barely touched food." The concern in her voice sounded convincing, but something felt off. Maybe it was because I had spent 46 years sitting across from Margaret and had learned how genuine love sounded. Or maybe it was because I could still see those social media posts in my head. I sat down without touching the coffee. Theodore immediately began talking about traffic. Catherine mentioned a delayed flight. Then they both complained about how stressful the last few days had been. The conversation felt strange. Their mother had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. Yet somehow they had turned themselves into the victims. Several minutes passed before I noticed something beside Theodore's chair. A black leather briefcase. It looked expensive, professional, completely out of place for a visit between family members. My eyes stayed on it longer than they should have. Theodore noticed. For a fraction of a second, his smile disappeared. Then it returned. "Pop," he said, leaning back in his chair. "There's actually something we need to discuss." The room suddenly felt colder. Catherine glanced down at the table. Theodore reached for the briefcase. And that's when I realized they hadn't come to comfort their father at all. Theodore opened the briefcase and carefully removed a thick folder. The movement was smooth, confident, almost practiced. It reminded me of the way he used to prepare presentations when he was younger. Only this time, I wasn't his audience. I was his target. He placed the folder on the kitchen table between us and folded his hands. "Pop, we know the timing isn't ideal," he said. "But there are some important decisions that need to be made before things become complicated." I stared at the folder without touching it. "What decisions?" Catherine jumped in before Theodore could answer. "Just practical things, Daddy. The house, the estate, making sure everything is organized." The word estate hit me like a punch. Their mother had been buried less than a day ago, and already they were discussing assets. Theodore slid the folder closer. "Mom didn't leave a will," he explained. "That means probate. There are legal steps, deadlines. We need to be proactive." I finally opened the folder. Inside were printed documents, market reports, property evaluations, and several pages covered with notes. The more I looked, the worse it became. Someone had already researched the value of the house. Someone had already contacted a realtor. Someone had already prepared potential sales strategies. Catherine pointed at one page. "The market is really strong right now. Houses in this neighborhood are selling fast." Theodore nodded. "If we act quickly, we can maximize the value. Everybody benefits." Everybody. The word echoed in my head. Not once had either of them mentioned preserving their mother's home. Not once had they asked what I wanted. The conversation wasn't about grief. It wasn't about family. It was about money. I flipped through another page and froze. There was a proposed listing agreement. My name had already been typed beneath a signature line. Not handwritten. Not blank. Typed. Prepared in advance. As if my decision had already been made for me. How long have you been working on this? I asked quietly. Theodore and Catherine exchanged a quick glance. It lasted less than a second, but it told me everything. They had discussed this before. A lot. We've just been preparing, Theodore said carefully. Preparing for what? Neither of them answered immediately. The silence was answer enough. Then Theodore leaned forward and lowered his voice. Pop, you need to understand something. The house is worth a lot of money. It doesn't make sense for one person to sit on an asset like this. Asset, not home, not memories, not the place where their mother had spent most of her life. Just an asset. And at that moment, I began to suspect this conversation hadn't started after Margaret died. It had started long before that. I closed the folder and looked at my children for a long moment. Neither of them seemed uncomfortable. In fact, they looked prepared. That bothered me more than anything else. People who are having a difficult conversation usually stumble. They hesitate. They search for the right words. Theodore didn't. Every answer came too quickly, as if he had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times before arriving at my front door. How long? I asked. Theodore frowned. How long? What? How long have you been planning this? The room went quiet. Catherine stared at her coffee. Theodore leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. For the first time that morning, I saw a crack in his polished performance. A few months, he admitted. Maybe 6. We just wanted to be ready. 6 months. Margaret had only been gone for a single day. Yet they had been preparing for this while she was still alive, while she was fighting cancer, while she was spending her final weeks trying to hold our family together. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. You were planning what to do with the house before your mother died? Catherine immediately jumped in. Daddy, that's not fair. We knew the prognosis. The doctors knew the prognosis. Everyone knew what was coming. I looked at her. And your response was to start calculating property values? She looked away. Theodore took control again. Pop, you're making this emotional. I almost laughed. Emotional. We were sitting in the kitchen where Margaret used to bake birthday cakes for these two. We were sitting less than 24 hours after her funeral. And somehow I was the emotional one. Theodore continued speaking in the calm voice he probably used in business meetings. We're trying to protect the family. That's all. The market is strong. The timing makes sense. The numbers make sense. There it was again. Numbers. Timing. Strategy. Every word sounded like it belonged in a boardroom instead of a family home. Then, Theodore made a mistake. A small one, but enough. If the house sells around $650,000, Catherine and I should each receive roughly $180,000 after the estate is settled. The moment the number left his mouth, he realized what he had revealed. He had already done the math. Not recently. Not this morning. Long before today. Long before the funeral. Long before Margaret took her final breath. Suddenly, I wasn't looking at a grieving son anymore. I was looking at a man who had been waiting for a transaction to close. And the more I looked at him, the more I began to wonder if Margaret had seen it too. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Theodore sat there waiting for me to respond. Catherine kept staring into her coffee cup. I could feel both of them watching me, trying to predict my next move. But I wasn't looking at them anymore. I was looking somewhere else entirely. Back to a conversation I had almost forgotten. It happened 2 weeks before Margaret died. She had been lying in the hospice bed we set up beside the bedroom window. The afternoon sun was coming through the curtains, painting soft lines across the blanket. I remember sitting beside her, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of sleep. At one point, she squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. When I looked at her, she was staring directly at me. Her eyes were clear, clearer than they had been in days. Edwin, she said quietly, promise me something. I smiled and told her she could ask me anything. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, almost afraid. Then she glanced toward the hallway as if she wanted to make sure nobody else could hear. When I'm gone, pay attention. At the time, the words sounded strange. I thought the medication was making her confused. I told her not to worry. I told her everything would be fine. But she didn't smile. She kept looking at me with an expression I couldn't understand. I'm serious, she whispered. There are things you don't see because you don't want to see them. I remember laughing softly and telling her she was exhausted. Margaret had always worried too much. That was what I believed then. Looking back, I realized she wasn't worried. She was trying to warn me. Sitting at the kitchen table now, with Theodore's folder still lying between us, I suddenly remembered another detail. 3 days before she died, she had mentioned something else. Something I dismissed just as quickly. "There's something for you upstairs," she had said. "If the time comes, you'll know when to look." I never asked what she meant. I didn't want to talk about a future without her. None of us did. Theodore cleared his throat, pulling me back to the present. "Pop?" I looked at him. For the first time all morning, I saw impatience behind his professional smile. He wanted an answer. He wanted a signature. He wanted this process moving forward. And somehow that made Margaret's words feel even heavier. "There are things you don't see because you don't want to see them." The sentence echoed in my head. Then I made a decision. Not about the house. Not about the estate. About something else. Something I should have done the moment I came home from the funeral. Because suddenly, I knew exactly what Margaret had been trying to tell me. And I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I stood up so suddenly that both Theodore and Catherine looked surprised. Theodore started to say something, but I raised a hand and stopped him. "We're done for now," I said. "I need some time to think." Neither of them liked that answer. I could see it immediately. Theodore's jaw tightened. Catherine forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They wanted a decision today, preferably within the next hour. But for the first time since they arrived, I wasn't interested in what they wanted. I was thinking about Margaret, about her warning, about the strange certainty in her voice during those final days. Without another word, I walked past them and headed upstairs. I could hear them talking quietly behind me, but I didn't stop. The bedroom door creaked as I pushed it open. Everything inside looked exactly the way it had the morning Margaret left for hospice. Her favorite sweater still hung over the chair beside the window. A half-finished novel rested on the nightstand. Even her reading glasses were still lying open beside the lamp. For a moment, the grief hit me so hard I nearly turned around and left. But then I remembered why I had come. At the foot of our bed sat an old cedar chest that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother. We'd owned it for decades. It held quilts, family keepsakes, and things neither of us touched very often. Margaret had mentioned it once during her final week. At the time, I hadn't understood why. Now, I knelt in front of it and slowly lifted the lid. The scent of cedar filled the room. On top were several folded quilts. One had been stitched by Margaret's mother. Another had wrapped both of our children when they were babies. I carefully moved them aside one by one. Beneath them sat something I had never seen before, a small metal lockbox. I stared at it for several seconds. My heart was beating faster now. The box wasn't old. It looked recently purchased. Deliberate. Planned. Taped to the top was a brass key and a small handwritten note. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. I recognized it instantly. The note contained only 2 words. For Edwin, suddenly, every strange conversation from the last few weeks felt different. Every warning, every unfinished sentence, every look she had given me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. My hands trembled as I removed the key. Whatever was inside this box had been important enough for Margaret to hide. Important enough to prepare while she was dying. Downstairs, I could faintly hear Theodore moving around the kitchen. Upstairs, I sat alone on the bedroom floor with the last gift my wife had ever left me. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Margaret had known exactly what our children were planning all along. I sat on the bedroom floor for nearly a minute before unlocking the box. Part of me was afraid of what I might find. Another part already knew that whatever Margaret had left behind was about to change everything. The lock clicked open. Inside were 3 items: a thick legal envelope, a small digital voice recorder, and a sealed letter with my name written across the front in Margaret's handwriting. For a few seconds, I simply stared at them. Every item looked intentional. Every item looked planned. Margaret hadn't thrown these things together at the last minute. She had prepared them carefully, methodically, like someone building a safety net before a storm arrived. I reached for the letter first. The paper felt familiar beneath my fingers. Margaret had always preferred handwritten letters. Even after emails and text messages became common, She still believed important things should be written by hand. I opened it slowly and began to read. The first few lines nearly broke me. She wasn't talking about money. She wasn't talking about the house. She was talking about us, about our marriage, about the life we had built together. Then the tone changed. Margaret admitted there were things she had hidden from me. Not because she wanted to deceive me, but because she couldn't bear to watch my heart break. She wrote that she had seen changes in Theodore and Catherine long before I did. Small things at first. Requests for money that were never repaid. Excuses that stopped making sense. Conversations that always seemed to circle back to finances. She wrote that she had spent years convincing herself that our children would eventually mature. Years believing that one day they would remember what family actually meant, but that day never came. As I continued reading, the pieces started falling into place. Theodore's confidence, Catherine's performance downstairs, the folder, the calculations, the timing. None of it had appeared overnight. Margaret had been watching it happen for years. Then I reached a section that made me stop reading entirely. Margaret revealed that both of our children had taken large amounts of money from the family over the years, money that had never been returned, money I knew nothing about. The details were there. Dates, amounts, promises, excuses. Every page revealed another layer of deception. I felt sick, not because of the money itself. We could afford the money. What hurt was realizing how much Margaret had carried alone. She had protected me from these truths while she was alive, and now she was placing them in my hands after she was gone. Near the end of the letter, she mentioned the voice recorder. She didn't explain what was on it. She only wrote one sentence. "You need to hear this for yourself." I looked down at the recorder resting inside the box. Suddenly, it felt heavier than everything else combined. And deep inside, I already knew that whatever waited on that recording was going to destroy the last excuses I still had for my children. I stared at the voice recorder for several seconds before pressing play. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Whatever Margaret had wanted me to hear was waiting on that device. Whatever truth she had carried alone during her final weeks was about to become mine. At first, there was only the soft hum of the oxygen machine beside her bed. Then I heard Margaret's voice. Weak, tired, fragile. It was the voice of a woman fighting for every breath. A few moments later, another voice entered the room. Theodore. He sounded calm, respectful, almost caring. The same version of Theodore the world saw at conferences and business events. The version that knew exactly how to sound trustworthy. He asked how she was feeling. He told her he was worried about her. For a brief second, I wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding. Then the conversation turned to the house. Margaret immediately told him she wasn't interested in discussing property. Theodore ignored her. He explained that he had already prepared documents. He said putting the house into a trust controlled by him and Catherine would make everything easier after she passed away. Margaret told him no, firmly. Theodore tried again. He talked about protecting the family. He talked about efficiency. He talked about responsibility. Every word sounded reasonable. That was what made it so dangerous. He wasn't speaking like a son. He was speaking like a salesman closing a deal. Margaret refused a second time. Then I heard something change. The warmth disappeared from Theodore's voice. The patience vanished. What remained underneath was a man I barely recognized. "Mom," he said, "you need to stop thinking emotionally and start thinking logically." I felt my stomach tighten. Margaret was dying, and my son was lecturing her about logic. She told him to leave. Instead, Theodore kept going. Then came the words that shattered whatever hope I still had. He told her that if she refused to cooperate, it wouldn't matter. Once she was gone, he and Catherine could challenge everything in court. They could drag the process out for years. They could force legal battles. They could burn through money until there was almost nothing left. Then he said something even worse. He said my age made me vulnerable. He said I wouldn't have the energy to fight. He said eventually I would give up because that was what old people did. Margaret asked him one question. Her voice was shaking now. "You would do that to your father?" There was a long silence. Then Theodore answered, not with shame, not with hesitation, with certainty. "I'm doing what's best for the family's wealth." Wealth. Not family. Not love. Not loyalty. Wealth. In that moment, I finally understood. My son hadn't been waiting for his mother to recover. He had been waiting for control. The recording ended a few minutes later, with Margaret ordering him out of the room. Then her voice returned one final time. Soft, broken, determined. Edwin, if you're hearing this, don't doubt yourself. Don't let guilt make this decision for you. When the recorder clicked off, I sat frozen on the bedroom floor. Downstairs, Theodore was still waiting for my answer. What he didn't know was that his mother had already given me one. I stayed in the bedroom for several minutes after the recording ended. Not because I was shocked anymore. The shock was gone. What remained was clarity. For months, maybe years, I had been looking at my children through the eyes of a father who wanted to believe the best. Margaret had finally forced me to see them as they were. When I walked back downstairs, Theodore was standing beside the kitchen table. Catherine remained seated, nervously scrolling through her phone. Both of them looked up the moment I entered the room. Theodore spoke first. So, have you made a decision? His voice was calm, but I could hear the impatience underneath it. He thought he was waiting for a signature. He thought he was waiting for a negotiation. What he didn't realize was that the conversation had already ended upstairs. I placed the letter and the recorder on the table between us. Theodore's eyes immediately locked onto the recorder. For the first time all morning, the confidence disappeared from his face. Catherine noticed the change and looked confused. "What's that?" she asked. Neither of us answered. Theodore already knew. I watched him realize exactly what Margaret had done. I watched him understand that his private conversation with his dying mother was no longer private. The silence in the room became unbearable. "Mom knew," I said quietly. "She knew exactly what you were planning." Theodore's face turned pale. Catherine looked at him, then back at me, then back at him again. The pieces were finally falling into place. "Dad, whatever you think you heard," Theodore began. "I heard enough." He stopped talking. For the first time in his life, he had no prepared response, no sales pitch, no strategy, no numbers, just consequences. A few weeks later, both of them hired attorneys. It didn't matter. Every document Margaret had prepared held up perfectly. The house belonged entirely to me. The trust she created for the grandchildren remained protected. The legal challenges collapsed one after another. Even Theodore's attorney eventually advised him to walk away. The fight ended before it truly began. The real punishment, however, wasn't legal. It was personal. For the first time, Theodore couldn't manipulate the outcome. For the first time, Catherine couldn't hide behind excuses. They were forced to live with the knowledge that their mother had seen through them long before they ever saw it coming. I eventually sold the house on my own terms and moved into a smaller home near the mountains. I spent more time with my grandchildren. I donated money to the hospice that cared for Margaret. Slowly, life became peaceful again. Sometimes people ask if I ever forgave my children. The truth is more complicated than that. I stopped carrying the anger, but I also stopped carrying the illusion, and that was the lesson Margaret left behind. Love doesn't mean surrendering your dignity. It doesn't mean ignoring the truth because the truth hurts. Real love requires honesty, even when honesty breaks your heart. Every Sunday, I visit Margaret's grave and tell her about the week. And every Sunday, I leave with the same thought. In the end, she didn't save the house, she saved me.